Hi, welcome back. We've got another security stories, and this time I'm going to be talking out some of the details of the fights that I've been involved in. I've had a few comments, people saying, hey, I want to get more detail, what exactly happened in these fights, because often I just define them as, this guy was subdued or whatever. And I wanted to give a breakdown of exactly what tended to happen and a realistic kind of review of what really happens in violent situations when violence is part of your profession. And the main reason that I don't go into great detail is because I don't think it's something to particularly brag about. And also it's not the exciting kind of movie sequence that a lot of people probably imagine. And I'll go into why that is as well. So let's break down like a standard scenario that would often happen. I say often, I was probably involved in about maybe 100 or so serious fights, incidents where physical confrontation was involved. And, that was over a period of about 20 years. So, let's get that into perspective first. The vast majority of situations could be de-escalated and dealt with using psychology and tricks, and I've spoken a lot about that in my street violence series, and I've spoken a lot about that in some of the previous security videos I've done. So that was always the first method. I wasn't going to just be rushing in and battering people for the sake of it. I'm sure there are doormen and security guys out there that do that kind of thing, same as there are police that do that kind of thing, and also there's a lot of good guys that don't do that kind of thing for obvious reasons. So let's get that part out of the way first. So if there is no other recourse, this would be the kind of thing that would happen. I would be looking for a way to break up a fight, because normally I was attending an incident. We would get called to an incident, or I would see an incident take place, and I would have to stop that occurring. There would be violence from one person to another, or violence from both people. They were both trying to hurt each other, and I obviously had to stop that happening in the club. That was my job, to keep everyone in there safe, including the people that were fighting to a degree. So I would want to do that as efficiently and quickly as possible. Now in the movies, this is generally done by the doorman or bouncer walking over to the situation, announcing his presence to the people that are becoming violent, and having a kind of a stylized sequence where he says, hey, you stop doing that, points at the guy, if you don't stop doing that, we're going to have a fight. And it kind of escalates into this situation where they have this organized and agreed fight with each other. They both kind of take up a fighting pose, normally some martial arts kind of vibe to it, and then they begin this fight sequence where nobody else really gets involved, and these two guys have a fight, and there's like a clear winner and a clear loser. That simply just doesn't happen. It's completely unrealistic. I've probably been involved in one situation, I would say, where that kind of played out, whereby I think I've talked about this in a previous video, where a guy was threatening me. He was threatening to stab me for about 15 minutes, and he was alluding that he had a knife in his jacket in the inside pocket, and he was saying he was a member of the IRA, all this kind of stuff. He was clearly, slightly deluded or slightly drunk or whatever, and I was trying to just get him to go. I was just trying to get rid of him, because I don't want to have fights if I don't need to. But it came to a point, I was putting my hands out, I was saying, hey, stop, and it came to a point where he clearly wasn't going to stop. He said, right, I'm going to stab you. Went in for the inside of his jacket, at which point I kind of postured up into a classic boxing pose, and then as he stepped in, I just hit him with a straight left, and it actually knocked him spark out. And that was the one where I was smoking at the time. I don't smoke anymore, but at the time I was smoking cigarettes, and I took a cigarette out and flicked it, and as it happened, it just kind of hit him straight on the head while he was on the floor. And on the security camera, you saw this like shower of sparks bounce off of his head. Now I actually got arrested for that situation, and the police slyly played like only the 30-second clip of me stepping forward, punching this guy in the face, him going down, and then me flicking a cigarette into his forehead and like the sparks showering everywhere. And of course they said they wanted to charge me with what I think they called a Section 18 ABH, which is like an assault with intent. So they're saying because I stepped in that I intended to assault him. That's what I had in my mind before I actually carried it out. And I stepped in and then I punched this guy and assaulted him. Actually, at the time, I forced the police, or I said to them, look, this is ridiculous. You need to rewind that video. I demand to see the 15 minutes leading up to that. I hadn't actually called a solicitor in at the time. This was like in the preliminary interview where I went in there. They actually arrested me on the door for this. And the police officer begrudgingly rewound the tape. He clearly knew what was on this tape and that it wasn't going to bode well for their case. This gives you some idea of how the police can try and treat you. You know, a lot of people imagine in these sort of situations that the police are good guys and they are on the side of the morally right person and they are looking for some sort of, ethical situation where they're, oh, this guy's clearly doing the ethically right thing, we're going to support him and we're going to be against the guy who's not doing the ethically right thing. That is never really the way that I found that they work. They will just try and prosecute anyone and everyone and get their numbers up. They would have been just as happy to prosecute the guy who they couldn't even find, by the way. The victim of this crime had disappeared after the fact, after he had kind of come around. I kept an eye on him. He came around, he looked a bit groggy, and then he made his way off up the road. And the police actually saw this on CCTV for a completely different reason. I think they were reviewing footage for something else that had happened that night, and they came across this and decided to charge me with it. So they didn't even have a victim of the crime. No complaint was made against me, and they still tried to charge me with it. When they begrudgingly rewound the footage, they of course saw that about 15 minutes of this guy like gritting his teeth, clearly shouting at me, like spittle shooting out of his mouth because he was so angry. Me with my hands up, backing away calmingly, trying to explain to him that he should sort of go away. And I said to the officer, at this point, do you think I've behaved in a responsible manner? When compared to that 30-second clip, it obviously looked like I'd been completely irresponsible and just a bully. And that's the kind of footage you tend to see in the social media world as well, that they sort of take these last seconds of a clip. I think it happened in the Tommy Robinson situation a couple of weeks ago, that there was a clip circulating that he had knocked this guy out in an airport. It just showed Tommy Robinson standing over him, the guy on the floor unconscious, and then of course all the headlines were like, violent ex-football hooligan knocks out random person at airport. And in fact, it seems the story, there was a lot more to it than that this guy had hounded Robinson for quite a protracted period of time. He had been very aggressive towards him. He had gone to sort of lunge at him a few times, and in the end he had caught a punch. Now, that was probably the only time I'd like postured up and kind of engaged in a fist fight. There was maybe one other time where I opened a door of a nightclub to someone knocking on the door. They wanted to come in. I think the door had been shut because we were like beyond the hours of letting people in. And at that point, you could open it from the inside, but you couldn't get in from the outside. So, people could still get out in a fire, for example. When I opened the door to this person on the outside, they just immediately punched me in the face. I pushed them back, went outside, and then they assumed like a boxing stance with me, and then we went at it and had some boxing. I actually caught him with 2 or 3 punches. He then backed away. I didn't knock him out, but it definitely caught him with some solid strikes. I think a couple of jabs and then a straight left. He was not having any more of that. He then backed off and did the usual like shouting abuse at me from 20 metres down the way, and then he sort of made his way off. But those are really the only 2 times I can remember having this kind of classic fight scene, if you like. The rest of the time I would engineer a situation where I could use the most important things I had at my disposal. If you look at people that commit violence in terms of a professionalized level of violence, you know, that it's part and parcel of their job, they will always utilize all of the things that give them the advantage, you know, because it's not part of my job to put on a grand show. It's not part of my job to have some sort of Queensbury rules in effect. It's part of my job to be lawful, and it's part of my job to stop the threat, right? Either that threat's against me or it's against members of the public, but that was part of my job. And if you think about it, it's the same for military. You know, if you were a soldier, if you watch soldiers, they don't walk out into the middle of a battlefield, you know, and say, right, you guys over there, you know, you come out here and have a duel with me and it's all going to be fair and we're going to, you know, count to 10 and then we're going to start shooting at each other. That would be a ridiculous thing to do. It would get you killed probably. And although it fits within what people would say is a morally fair fight, you know, you're actually massively lessening your chances of survivability. The military on the whole depend on things like deception, you know, and they go in with shock tactics. They try to shock the enemy, they try to deceive the enemy, so they will hide in an ambush, wait for that enemy to come past and then launch an ambush that shocks the enemy, that scares them, you know, that takes them off guard. So they're utilizing those things. And we did exactly the same when we worked on the door. You know, if I saw a fight kicking off or about to kick off, I would look at grabbing the person that I perceived to be the biggest threat. That could be the person who was the physically more imposing of the two or more, or it could have been the person that was the most aggressive, you know, that had the most aggressive body language, that was shouting the loudest, etc. So it would really depend entirely on the context. I would then look to come up behind that person without being seen, without making a big scene. I wouldn't sort of announce myself. I wouldn't do anything to let anyone in that crowd know that I was going to get involved. I would approach them from a direction where they couldn't see me. I would try not to kind of catch any of their friends' attention, and then I would grab them generally round the neck, because if you take control of someone's head and you take them off balance, you've straight away won. You know, they're not going to maintain anything if you're taking them off balance. So I would just tip them backwards. I would have control of their neck. I would generally have one arm around it. That would give me options. So if I've got one arm around their neck and I take them backwards off balance, I've still got one arm free. So I'd have my left hand free, which is my strong hand. I could use that to fend people off. I would still have both my legs working, so I could kick out if I needed to. I could also strike if I needed to, because sometimes I would be the only person dealing with this situation. There would be guys that might be tied up in other situations that couldn't get to me. So my safety is my preliminary concern. Obviously my secondary concern is the safety of the other people in the club, the people that I'm trying to look after, right? And then thirdly is my concern about like the club itself, the reputation, the damage to furniture, all that kind of thing. But that was the least of my concerns. So once I've grabbed this person and I've kind of taken them off balance, I've got two options. If other people started getting involved, I would still maintain control over that person, possibly by tightening my hold, because psychology plays a big role in this. You know, that one of the reasons I developed myself to be very strong and very powerful in those days was because if you can put on power very quickly and you are clearly a lot stronger than the person that you're fighting with, it takes a lot of the energy out of them. You know, if you feel an incredibly strong arm come around your neck and it feels like a lump of granite, and you're swiftly taken off your feet and they can carry your body weight with relative ease, the idea that you're going to do anything to overpower them is kind of sapped out of you quite quickly. And that was very effective. But often some of their friends would try and get involved. Sometimes I would have to hand them off. Sometimes I would have to actually punch out at them, or use a front kick, to get people out of the way. If they were trying to grab me off of the guy, which would generally happen, I would often, with my left foot, kick out into the chest or stomach area, because again, don't forget, a lot of these people have had too much to drink, and when you suddenly get kicked in the stomach or the chest, it doesn't do any serious damage generally, but what it does do is take the wind out of people's sails, and it makes them feel pretty sick. Occasionally people actually were sick at that point. It generally takes them onto the floor, so they fall backwards on the floor. They're incredibly winded. They lose the the impetus that they want to kind of get involved, and also it's quite a scene for the others. So if they see someone front kicked and clutching their chest or stomach and rolling around in pain on the floor, it makes the other people in the area think twice about getting involved with you as well. And all the time I've still got control over the main candidate that I've selected, the most aggressive guy, the biggest guy. And this would work with really big guys as well. As long as I was powerful enough to maintain a tight grip around the neck, and I had enough stamina to keep that up, then I could do that to pretty imposing guys. I remember one guy was probably about 6'5". He was probably in the region of 280 pounds, a very, very big guy, and I actually had to jump onto his back, and I put him in a sleeper. No one else was getting involved. He was actually trying to run around with me on his back and kind of bash me into walls to get me off. I was like an annoying parasite, but because I did have decent arm strength, it took 15-20 seconds, but I actually started feeling the fight draw out of him, and then he went down onto his knees and eventually actually lost consciousness because I had cut off the blood supply. The sleeper hold cuts off blood, it doesn't cut off air that most people think, and he then slumped onto the floor. He actually ended up pooping his pants, and I think I've made a story about this guy before. They carried it, he was so big they had to load him onto a golf trolley because we were at a club on the end of a pier, and they actually had to drive him all the way down the pier and kind of get rid of him at the other end, and they sort of had his bum angled out the back of this golf trolley because he actually stank and he'd pooed his pants. That kind of thing wasn't unusual. Again, people were on drugs or they were drunk. That generally was why they were getting violent. So a lot of the time they would lose control of bodily fluids, wet themselves or poo themselves, be sick, all those kind of things. And that would also help take the fight out of people. If you shit your pants, you're probably not thinking of standing there like a hero and slogging it out with the doorman in front of a large crowd because you stink and you've got poo down your pants. So, that's a helpful thing. But it's also pretty distasteful, that you don't see that in movies, that a lot of the stuff that happens in fights is very unpalatable. It's not nice at all. When people tended to come round, if I had to put them to sleep in those situations, when they came round, I would have a lot of mixed emotions. Generally speaking, it was like someone waking up from a dream. They were very confused. They were sometimes very frightened. And these were some big, powerful guys as well. That they weren't like little muppets. They were some seriously strong guys that you would see them come round. Some of them would cry. Some of them didn't know what had happened to them. Some of them had kind of a completely different story in their head to what had actually happened. So they would be begging me to help them find the person that had put them to sleep in the first place, not really realizing it was actually me that had done it. I don't know if that was the psychology of that I had kind of frightened them, so they were trying to win my favor, or if they had actually become so confused in that moment that they had completely blacked out on the fact that I had been the one to grab hold of them. Maybe they just didn't realize that at all, so it was not a pleasant thing. It wasn't a pleasant thing to see these guys in various states of distress, but it was necessary. So that tended to be my go-to. Sometimes in those situations it didn't always pan out because there was just too many people and it was too chaotic. I remember one night we had a bunch of Russian guys come into a nightclub, and they were pretty tough looking guys, you know, but at the time they came to the door, there was about 5 or 6 of them. We didn't have any major reasons not to let them in. I'm always a big believer on giving people chances unless I've got real evidence or reasons to not let people in, you know, because sometimes you can make judgments about someone. You know, I maybe don't look the nicest guy to let into a club. In fact, I've been stopped from going into clubs before when I was younger because of that reason. But I would be someone who would never like kick off in a club unless someone was trying to really do me some harm, because I have some respect for the guys that work there. I respect the club. I'm a guest in that place. You know, I try to act as a general decent human being. So you shouldn't always judge people based on looks. In this situation, I maybe should have made a judgment about these Russian guys. They had come in. They were quite friendly at first, but as Russians do, they started downing a lot of spirits. And there was some friction between them and some other guys in the club, because obviously when you have clubs where you've got your local kind of dudes that hang out, the little cliques, and then a strange bunch of guys come, especially if they're not from that country, and there's some peacocking going on. You know, the Russian guys looked pretty imposing, as I've mentioned, so I'm sure the local dudes found that threatening, and things started getting out of hand. We had to break up this quite large fight, and the Russians quickly just started attacking us. You know, at first we were sort of trying to help the Russians to get them out of the club, because we didn't want more and more of the locals all joining in and just, you know, surrounding these Russian guys and sort of kicking them all in on the floor. But the Russian guys surprisingly quickly just turned on us, you know, so it turned into like the door guys versus the Russian guys. And I think there was like 3 of us and, like I say, about 5 or 6 of them. And normally with the English guys, when we would fight them, you know, you could take the wind out of them, like I've just mentioned. Like you might hit them, or you might sort of bend them up a bit, cause them some minor pain, and suddenly they would realise this guy seems pretty strong. I'm a bit drunk. I'm out of my league, kind of thing. I'm going to wind my neck in and I'm going to leave, and they would become quite compliant, and that would be that. With the Russian guys, there was none of that. You know, they didn't give a damn about anything like that. They were obviously used to taking some pretty extreme punishment. They didn't care about getting punched. They didn't care about getting kicked. One of the guys I ended up scrapping with, I actually kicked him 3 times in the head because he was coming in at me, and he was kind of coming in quite low and trying to sort of grab me and flail and punch me at the same time. He wasn't the greatest fighter. I'm guessing he was trying to sort of grab me and take me off my feet. And at the time I was doing a lot of training for MMA, so as he was coming in, I was literally roundhouse kicking him in the head. It was like waist height sort of thing, so it was a prime object kick, and he was just shrugging it off, you know, like it was nothing. Which I've got to say is pretty disconcerting, you know, from my perspective. If you're doing something to someone that you feel, you know, you feel that you're quite strong, and you feel you've connected, and you feel that that should have had some sort of impactful sort of force upon them, and then they just sort of shrug it off and continue to come at you, you start to become a little bit worried at that point. And that gives you an idea of like the differences in mentality between people. You know, a lot of time fights are won or lost. Not everyone gets knocked out, right? You know, it's quite hard to actually knock someone out. I can probably list them on like one hand, the guys that got knocked out. Most people don't, you know, it's quite difficult to get that perfect punch and spin someone's jaw to do that. So a lot of the guys would take enough of a beating whereby they just thought to themselves, oh, this isn't going well for me, I've got blood leaking out my face, I'm going to give it up. But when you have people that don't care about that, you know, they don't care about their own personal health and safety, and all they care about is fighting and winning, you're in some serious trouble. You know, you've really got to do that other person some quite significant damage to get them to stop, and that then becomes quite unpleasant. And that's what happened with these Russian guys. I had to fight this guy quite brutally, and like I say, I'd already landed like 3 odd kicks on him. I began striking with him. I think I probably hit him in the face about 15 times. Like I say, he wasn't the greatest fighter, but he was a physically imposing guy. He had landed a couple of strikes on me as well. So, you know, I wasn't in great shape either. I think I had a black eye, split lip, all that kind of thing. Eventually, he kind of gassed, and at the same time, I think he had taken so many blows that he was pretty much done, and he got dragged out. A couple of other doormen that had finished doing what they were doing came over and picked this guy up and dragged him off. But that just gives you an idea of fighting with different people, different mentalities, different cultures, that there's always going to be something different going on, you know, that not everything's going to be easy for you. And you have to bear that in mind. You know, if someone's on drugs, for example, and those drugs have given them, you know, false confidence, a lack of ability to feel pain, you're going to see exactly the same thing. I dealt with people that had, you know, sniffed way too much cocaine, and they were very similar in that they were full of themselves. They suddenly thought that they were Chuck Liddell, and they had no ability to actually feel pain. And it also removed that personal sort of care element that we all have. You know, if someone punches me and breaks my nose, I'm thinking, oh Jesus, I've got to go and get that fixed. That could be a permanent scar. You know, if someone like smashes my teeth out, I'm in my normal mind, I'm thinking this is going to cost me a lot of money, my teeth are all ruined. And that happened a lot, by the way. I got most of my teeth smashed out at one point or another, and it cost me a ton in dentistry, and I'm still missing teeth to this day because even the repairs, after a while, they fell out as well. So it's definitely not good. If you value having a Hollywood smile, do not get into old school door work or violent situations, because it costs you a lot of money in dentistry. But you know, the those elements that we normally have, that I would normally have, and any reasonable person would normally have, are quickly eroded if someone has had too much alcohol or if they've had a bunch of drugs, and then they become far more dangerous. You know, I'd rather fight someone who had like a reasonable level of personal safety about them, because generally speaking, you can kind of jab them a couple of times and they're going to go, okay, this guy is pretty strong, he knows how to fight. You know, I don't really want to engage in this. And I would have the same mentality. You know, if I was out and for some reason, I don't think I would, but if for some reason I got involved in some sort of mutually agreed fight with another guy and he jabbed me a couple of times and, you know, hurt me badly, I'd be thinking, maybe there's another way out of this. You know, do I really want to enter into a fight where we're both going to suffer big time? You know, there's no winners in that. You're just both going to end up in A&E. You're both going to be probably end up locked in a prison cell. So, you know, that's something I wouldn't want to engage in. But there are people out there that do. You've also got criminals out there that have become so desensitized to this kind of violent behavior that they don't care. Maybe they've been brought up in households where violence was common. You know, their parents may have been violent to them. And if they've come from that background and they've got nothing to lose, they become very dangerous people. So these are all reasons why I would use things like deception and surprise to get the best out of a situation. You know, I wasn't going to just sort of walk in and stand in front of guys like Patrick Swayze and say, hey, you know, let's have a fight, because I could be dealing with someone who has no morals and who has no cares about the law and who has no cares about their personal safety. That's a very, very dangerous person to be dealing with, because he doesn't care what the outcome of that is. You know, if he ends up killing me, then so what? You know, living in a prison cell might be better for him than his current circumstance. I met quite a few Albanian guys that told me that they were career criminals that had come over from Albania, and when I asked them, weren't they concerned about getting arrested over here, and they laughed and said, your prison cells are way nicer than my terrible place that I had to stay in Albania. So no, I'm not at all worried about the consequence of that. I could happily live in prison. And they explained that they would run their criminal enterprises within prison anyway, selling drugs, whatever they do. So they would continue to live, you know, in a fairly pleasant lifestyle for them, all paid for by the UK taxpayer. So for them, it was no consequence. You know, if they killed me in a fight, whatever, no big deal. those aren't really people that you really want to be having a fight with if you can help it, right? And if you do have a fight with those kind of people, you actually need to take every advantage you can and to switch it off as quickly, or switch them off as quickly as possible. There are several times when people had weapons, you know, knives or bottles or podium poles, all kinds of makeshift weapons that you can think of in a nightclub. And those rules that I've just discussed about kind of utilizing every advantage came into effect even more so at that point. You know, if someone was wielding a bottle, I would go in even harder. I would go in with a surprise. I wouldn't, you know, let them detect that I was coming in to begin with. I would generally use exactly the same techniques. I would come in from behind. Sometimes if they were like wielding a dangerous item, a few times I would come in with a sucker punch from behind. So I'd hit first and then wrap up the neck, take them off their feet if the sucker punch hadn't already done that, and then drag them out extremely quickly. I mean, one of the things you can do, if you grab someone's neck and take them off their feet really quickly and you've got the room, you can just really quickly take them out backwards, and almost that you're then sort of using them as a shield in front of you, and the guys are sort of catching up, because people's brains don't function that quickly, especially if they've been drinking or taking drugs, that it takes them a few seconds to kind of realise what's going on. And in that few seconds, you can have got that person halfway across the dance floor and be going out of one of the doors with them. Once you've got them out, you know, that's probably the main guy that was causing the problem. You've got them out of the equation. You can then go back in and start dealing with the others. It's going to be easier. One of the main things I've always felt in fights is that, especially if you're dealing with a group, it's like a numbers game. One of the big mistakes I saw doormen doing would be to go in, they would like hit one guy, come off of him, then like be fighting with another guy and like maybe do a little bit of damage to him or not, and then with another guy, and suddenly they're fighting like 4 or 5 different people, and you've given those 4 or 5 different people time to get involved and kind of evaluate the situation, and now they're all going to be busy coordinating their effort to actually beat up that one doorman. To me, it's a numbers game. If you've got hold of one person, then you've got to take them out of the equation, you know, because if you've got 4 guys, I want to quickly turn that into 3 guys. And if I let go of that one person I've already got, and he's able to kind of bring himself round and get back up and get back into the fight, I'm back to 4 guys again. I'm at a big disadvantage. So in those situations, I want to get hold of that guy and take him out of that fight quickly, whether that be I drag him out of the fight, or whether that be I do something to him that renders him unconscious or renders him unable to fight any further. So in those situations, you know, if I had hold, I remember once like having hold of a guy and I had to put him in a sleeper because he was incredibly violent. He had a handful of mates with him that were also violent, but they were like the parasitical type friends. You know, I didn't think they were the main culprits. They were kind of looking to him for, you know, moral support. And I knew that if I kind of put him out of the game, that they would be easier to deal with. But while I was putting him to sleep, I could feel some blows coming onto my head. Now, normally speaking, I think a lot of the doormen in those situations, when they feel they're getting attacked, would let go of the person they're dealing with and try to then deal with the blows coming in. But then now, like I've said, you just increase the number of people who are going to be attacking you, because now that main culprit is going to get back up. He's going to empower the others. They're all going to attack you at once. So I would generally focus on putting that guy out of the fight. I would kind of utilize my body to rain off blows as much as possible. Generally speaking, blows to the top of the head aren't really going to hurt you. Blows to the back aren't really going to do much to you. Those are very resilient parts of the body. So if I can kind of get someone and then kind of crouch down enough to keep my face out of the picture and to present the kind of top of my head to people, it's probably going to hurt their fists a lot more than it's going to hurt me. I might have a couple of welts in the morning, but they're going to have broken knuckles for sure if they're full force punching me in the top of my head. So I would firstly get rid of that guy, put him to sleep on the floor, then I would get up and start dealing with the other guys, and generally speaking at that point they've lost the will. They would sort of then start moving backwards, shouting abuse, you know, the usual stuff that goes on in those situations. Oh, you're an arsehole, what have you done to our mate? That would usually buy you enough time whereby you've got support and backup that have arrived that can then kind of grab hold of these other perpetrators. You can then get back to dealing with the guy who's probably just coming round at this point and dragging him out. Now, I would caveat all this that the most important thing that you can know before doing any of this stuff is the law. Because all this stuff I've just said, you know, it sounds brutal, and it was brutal, but the main thing was I was well aware of where the line of the law was, and I would always be careful to step up to it but not over it. And this is where a lot of people go wrong, because criminals don't care about the law. You know, people that are off their heads on drugs don't care about the law. The perpetrators in these situations didn't really think or care about the law. But me being the professional in this situation, or even if you're just a reasonable member of the public, and like most of us, you have morals, you have a lot to lose, so you don't want to end up in prison, you don't want to leave your family without you being able to work, all that kind of thing. So we all care about the law, and that can hamstring you, because if you don't understand the law and what you're able to do or not do, then you caring about it and not wanting to break it can lead to you making weak decisions. It can lead to you leaving yourself incredibly vulnerable in these sorts of situations. So you should know exactly where that line is. Now, when it comes to violence, this can be quite tricky. So you have to be reasonably intelligent and have a good look through self-defense and the law in the UK to understand what you can and can't do. And for a basic synopsis, you know, that the defence laws in the UK allow you to defend yourself, and it allows you to defend third parties. And it allows you to use what's called reasonable force. And this is where a lot of misunderstanding comes in, because people have said, well, it's reasonable to punch someone once, but it's not reasonable to punch them twice, or it's not reasonable to kick them in the head, but it's totally reasonable to grab them, you know, and all these different things. Oh, it's not reasonable to grab them around the neck, you could really hurt them, but it's reasonable to grab their arms. I've heard all this sort of nonsense. None of that is defined in law. You know, the law is quite open-ended in its wording, which is why people get very confused about it. Most people that say they have an understanding haven't actually read the law itself. They've heard it from some guy in a pub or whatever, so they're just parroting the bullshit that they've been told by someone else. So I would strongly recommend, you know, if you're in this kind of a job, or if you're in a place or a situation where you're likely to be involved in violence, or you just care about being able to protect yourself and your family, that you understand exactly what you can and can't do in these situations. Once you do that, it actually empowers you, because you can confidently do certain things in these situations that you may not normally do, because you would be very worried about overstepping, you know, that you could end up in prison. And there isn't a situation in these sort of contexts where you're never going to be arrested, right? Like I said before, the police don't operate like that. They're going to arrest everyone. They don't care about the morals. They don't care. There's many times where I've dealt with criminals that the police full well know these are career criminals with records as long as your arm. I've got no criminal record. I've knocked the guy out, or I've dealt with him and he's injured, and the police will still arrest me, even though they know that that other guy is a violent crack dealer and I'm working as a doorman. But they arrest us both, you know. And this wasn't like because they were incompetent, so they didn't have the information. You know, they knew full well what was going on, but they still would chance their arm. So you can't look at these things in terms of what the police do or don't do. They're just going to gather up as many people as possible. And I've always thought of them as, you know, they're not arbiters of the law. They're just kind of transporting you to and from the law, if you like. The actual decisions will be made by the CPS on whether you're actually due to be prosecuted or not. And then after that, if it got further than that, it would go to court and the decision would be made by a judge or a jury, whatever, magistrate. So that's what you have to think about. Don't think about, oh, will the police like this or not? I don't care if the police like it or not. You know, the police don't like any of this stuff. The police's attitude is that you should phone 999, and then 2.5 hours later the police will arrive when everyone's laying on the floor bleeding to death. So, you know, what they like isn't the best thing for your health and safety. You know, I'd say the same thing if you were attacked within your home. If someone turns up at your home and starts kicking your door in, and the police's kind of go-to ethos on that is, oh, you should just call the police and try and be safe in your home. Well, if the door gets kicked in, they're not going to help you. You know, they might be an hour away, and in that time you're taking whatever damage, you know, you might be killed, whatever. So that isn't a recipe for personal safety, but the law does give you a recipe for personal safety. So the police don't necessarily quote the law. They don't maybe even fully understand defence law. Some of the police I dealt with certainly didn't understand defence law. And some will just try and utilise it against you and try and trip you up. So the first thing to understand what you can and can't do, and you have to imagine this. You know, I always imagined if this ended up in court, what would a member of the jury, a normal, reasonable person, think about my actions? You know, if a woman's being attacked and kicked in the head when she's on the floor half conscious, and I go over and punch that guy in the side of the head 3 times and knock him out, and he's been quite seriously damaged from that, you know, would a reasonable person suggest that my actions were okay in that situation? And generally speaking, I think they would, you know, because most of us think that a man should not be kicking the crap out of a woman who's semi-conscious on the floor. And he's obviously clearly an incredibly violent person that's doing that. He clearly doesn't care about the law. He's clearly a threat to her. He would clearly be a threat to me if I announced my presence to him and walked up and said, hey, excuse me, can you stop doing that? And tried to tickle him or whatever. You know, that he's not going to react in a normal and pleasant way to that. So I've done something in that situation that I felt was reasonable, and that's what the jury have to consider, was did I feel it was reasonable in that situation? Not just did the jury think it's reasonable, they have to think what the judge will ask them to consider is, did this person act reasonably in that situation, in the context of, did they feel like their life or someone else's life was in danger? And then can the jury understand why they would have done those things, or were those things kind of over the top? You know, so if I punched that guy 3 times, then he fell on the floor, and then I stamped up and down on his head, now we're into another situation of crossing over into unreasonable, right? Because I've dealt with the threat, I've stopped him being a threat to that woman, I've stopped him possibly hurting me, but now I'm actually exacting revenge on him and jumping up and down on his head. So in that sort of thing, that could be classed as unreasonable. That's how I always imagined situations. You know, what would I think if I was a member of the jury and I was kind of reviewing this situation? I've also heard people say, you know, that if it's self-defense, that you have to wait to be attacked, or you have to wait for them to attack someone else. Also not true. Self-defense in the UK does give you access to something called a preemptive strike, which I utilised multiple times during those 20 odd years. Basically meaning that if I feel that my health safety is under threat, that it's inevitable that I'm going to be seriously hurt or maybe even killed, that I can do something to stop that from happening before the other person has actually done it. So an idea of that situation would be like in that video I described at the beginning, where on video the guy is alluding to having something in his jacket, he's gritting his teeth, he's got inflamed body language, you know, he's clearly being very aggressive. The video didn't actually have audio, but you could watch the video and anyone of any sound mind would have seen this guy is like a super aggressive guy and the other guy is not being so aggressive. And then as he lunges towards me, although he hasn't physically done anything to me at that point, I've struck him and knocked him unconscious. That was a preemptive strike. And like the police said, oh, you stepped in to make it. Yes, I needed to step in to make it, because if I didn't step in, I would have actually swung a punch and then taken myself off balance and put myself into more danger. The police actually said at that point as well, it looks like you're trained to punch like that. And I said, yes, I have trained to punch like that. The police were trying to use that against me to say that, you know, I'm some sort of trained martial artist, and therefore that was more unfair. Again, we're going to this morally sort of ambiguous situation. It doesn't really matter if it's fair or unfair. It matters if it's legal or illegal. In that situation, I utilised the training that I had to make an effective preemptive strike against a person that was threatening to stab me to death. So that was completely reasonable. Same thing goes with utilising weaponry. You know, if I'm in a club and 3 guys pick up bottles and they all come at me and they're going to smash those bottles over my head, it would be perfectly reasonable of me to pick up whatever I can, you know, get to hand, whatever I can grab, and utilise that to defend myself. There wouldn't be a jury on the planet that would kind of send you down for whatever that was. And people often discuss the outcome being the kind of deciding factor. So what if in that situation, you know, I whacked one of those guys with a stool, a bar stool, for example, and he ended up having a brain hemorrhage and then he even died. You know, would the outcome of that, i.e. him dying, implicate me in some sort of criminal manner? Well, it would be discussed in court, but actually the main crux of that discussion would be, was it reasonable of me to try and defend myself against 3 armed opponents when I hadn't actually instigated this situation? 3 guys are trying to hit me over the head with bottles, which could kill me. I then strike one of them to defend myself. What happens to him after that strike is really neither here nor there at that point. It would have an effect if I was under criminal charges, if I was the instigator, if I had sort of chased some guy down with a chair and ended up battering him and killing him, then the outcome of his situation would also be detrimental to me. You know, not only have I assaulted him, but now he's died as well, so that would all be taken into account. But it certainly wouldn't affect you in a self-defense case. And you know, one of the ones I've mentioned before is Kenny Noy, who was a known criminal. He actually stabbed a person who was prowling around in his garden. Kenny's argument in court was that he was a known career criminal. He had people that had said that they wanted to kill him. He then had what he thought was a assassin in his back garden. So he went into the garden with a kitchen knife to, you know, protect himself. And he then stabbed at this person in the dark. That person ended up dying. That person ended up being a policeman that was conducting some surveillance work that shouldn't really have been there. I don't even know if they had warrants. But certainly Kenny Noy didn't know that they were there. So he has said, yeah, I just thought it was some assassin. Just because the person died, that didn't have any bearing on whether or not Kenny Noy was guilty. In that case, it turned out that he got not guilty because he was seen to act reasonably in the situation, that he was defending himself against what he thought was a dangerous armed assassin in his back garden. It just so happened that years later, I think he stabbed someone again on the side of a motorway over a road rage incident. And then at that point, he tried to use self-defense as well. Witnesses gave other versions of the story, and he got found guilty of that because obviously he was a violent career criminal and he just stabbed someone because he was angry. The reasons that you do these things, the motivation is important. You know, if you were to sort of get involved in one of these situations, if I saw that guy kicking a girl on the floor, we'll go back to that incident, I run over and punch him 3 times in the face and I knock him out, and then the police arrest me and say, you know, why did you punch that guy 3 times in the face? And I say, I saw what he was doing, I was really angry with him, and I thought that guy needs to be taught a lesson, so I brutally beat him. Now, I have not acted in self-defense at that point. My own words have just convicted me. I've just admitted that I wasn't scared for the woman's life and I wasn't scared for my own life. I was just angry and I wanted to take my anger out on this guy So I basically acted in a vengeful manner. UK law does not have any sort of leeway for vengeance. You know, it doesn't say an eye for an eye. The Bible might say it. Again, we're back to the morality clause. The Bible says, you know, if someone takes your eye, you can take theirs back. That's not what the law says in this country. So never think that that's fair. You know, if someone punches you in the face and begins to walk off, and then you run up behind them and punch them in the back of the head and they fall over and die, you're going to be in serious trouble. It's not going to help your case to say, oh yeah, but they hit me first, so, you know, I had to defend myself. When someone's walking away from you and the threat is over with, there is no need for further defence. The same thing happens with burglar situations, with the Tony Martin situation. Number one, I mean, he was waiting in a darkened house for the burglars. He was waiting there with an illegal firearm, so he'd already kind of set himself up for prosecution. But more to the point, that he announced he was there, and then as they ran away, he shot them. There's no situation of self-defense which allows you to shoot people in the back or punch or chase someone down that's running away and brutally beat them, because that ceases to be self-defense. Then that becomes an act of vengeance, revenge, and you're going to face the full force of the law for that. So understand, you know, this is a complex and nuanced issue. I understand why people don't want to understand it. They don't want to take the time to read up on it. But if you're professionally involved in this kind of thing, you really need to get a grasp of all that and have confidence in your understanding of it, so you are best able to protect yourself and others. Thank you very much for watching. I hope that enlightens some people. I hope that sheds some light on the fact that not all the encounters that you see in the movies are replicated in the real world. You know, most encounters aren't this cool looking martial arts fight, you know, where it's sort of going back and forth and then the best technical fighter wins. That's sports fighting. You know, if you want to go and see that, then go and watch the UFC or whatever. There's plenty of that available. But in the real world, it's deceptive, it's shocking, it's brutal. Some of the outcomes are very disturbing, and it's generally incredibly chaotic. And if you're the professional involved in that, you know, you have to navigate your way through that chaos in the best way possible, which is not a easy job. So if you see stuff online of, you know, 10-second clips of doormen or security guys or police forces or whatever acting in certain ways, you know, always think, what is the context of that? What's the longer clip going to look like? How was the victim in that clip behaving to cause this to happen in the first place? Like I said, there are some bad people out there. I met plenty of awful doormen, but I also met plenty of good doormen, and I met some good police officers. Not that many, but quite a few. And you know, they do exist, less and less so, but they do exist. So always give people a chance before you make ridiculous comments on social media about this stuff, make judgments on people. But it's something to bear in mind, you know. And if you're thinking of getting into security work these days, I would strongly recommend you don't, because the pay is now awful, the conditions are awful, your colleagues are generally going to be awful. You know, there's literally nothing good about it, and you're likely to get stabbed, bottled, spat on, God knows what. And you know, the glory days of the security industry are over. Thank you very much. Always appreciate the views. If you guys haven't subscribed, please do so. I really appreciate subscriptions, because that's what helps this channel. I really appreciate comments and views on the videos as well. Have a great weekend. I'll catch you all next time.